Hi, and welcome to Simply Christ. My name is Mark Shepard. Glad you are joining us. If you have not subscribed, please do so. Also, make sure to hit the like button, share this with your friends, and leave a comment. Let's jump right into it today. Today, we are going to be talking about spiritual movement. It's going to be where we left off from our previous videos talking about being born in the Spirit, because it's all tied in. I'm not going to go into a large discourse as to what we discussed about in those videos, so I will leave the link below in the description. You can check it out, look at those. Also, I will leave a link to the Aramaic scriptures. The Aramaic scriptures is what I'm using here. You'll be able to follow. It's a great resource to understanding the common language of Jesus' time. Of course, you don't have to follow along with that one. If you use another version, it's fine. But I think you will find some things that are very interesting in the Aramaic scripture. Let's set the stage. Nicodemus, a leading Jewish ruler of Jesus' day, comes to Jesus at night and says, "You are a great teacher, fantastic teacher. Lots of things you're talking about which are great. We know God's with you because nobody could do these things unless God was with them. But there's some things I really don't understand what you're talking about." So Jesus talks to Nicodemus and tells him, you must be born again. What is born again? Well, it's about a spiritual rebirth. We tied that into our videos into Genesis chapter 1. And how that all fits, I will let you check that out in the video and find out for yourself. Check that out. I really think you'll enjoy seeing where the connection with Genesis chapter 1 and being born of the Spirit really all ties in a very interesting, unique way that only God can put together. So let's go ahead and go into where in John chapter 3, verse 8, where one of the most strangest, I guess, if you can say, of Jesus' sayings, but it should be very strange to us because Jesus spoke in many parables and in concepts and ideas, but in very spiritual ways. In fact, Jesus says throughout his ministry, "He who has ears, let him hear." He's talking about he who is willing to hear spiritually, who has spiritual insight, looking for those things, a person who has surrendered themselves to hear these things and is thinking spiritually, he'll hear these things. But a person who isn't won't hear these things. And that is supported by one of the verses we're going to read now. So let's go right into it. John chapter 3, verse 8. "The wind, the place where it pleases, blows, and you hear the sound, but you do not know where it comes and unto where it goes. Thus so is everyone who is born from the Spirit." Nicodemus answered and said unto him, "How can these things be?" Yeshua answered and said unto him, "You are a teacher of Israel, and you do not understand these things? Truly, truly, I say unto you, that the thing which we know we speak, and the thing which we see we testify, and our testimony you won't receive. If of the earth I have spoken unto you, and you aren't believing now, or how, if I speak unto you of the heavens, will you believe?" So what Jesus is trying to describe here is the fact that people who are born of the Spirit have these specific qualities. But Nicodemus didn't quite understand that. Jesus says, "You're a teacher of Israel, you don't understand these things." And then he says, again, looking here in verse 11, "Truly, truly, I say unto you, that the thing which we know we speak, and the thing which we see we testify, and our testimony you don't receive. If of the earth I have spoken unto you, and you aren't believing, how, if I speak unto you of the heavens, will you believe?" Nicodemus was a very learned person, a very learned man. I mean, this is an individual who knew the Old Testament. I mean, these are people who memorized the Old Testament, or at least great portions of it. They could dissect it, they could trisect it, they could put it all every which way. They could probably quote it backwards. I mean, that's how much they knew this. Very, very, very deep, and especially in that culture and knowing these things. Yet, he didn't understand these concepts, which goes to show that we can know all kinds of things about the Bible, but not have any inkling into the spiritual teachings of Jesus Christ. So is he really our master? That's something we have to ask ourselves. Are we intellectually wrapped up into Jesus, or are we spiritually wrapped up and motivated by Jesus? And then Jesus says, "I would love to tell you more about these things." I'm paraphrasing, of course. how can I tell you more about these spiritual concepts if you don't understand earthly concepts and put together with heavenly concepts? If you don't see the metaphor and the connection of those, how am I going to speak to you about more heavenly things? So again, it's a very difficult thing for Nicodemus to grasp, and it shows the depths of the spiritual life and what Jesus is really asking from his disciples. The people that he's talking about here in this verse, talking about the things which we know, and he says here in verse 11, we speak, the things which we know we speak. He's talking about individuals who are just the common people of his day. They're understanding it. So the common people were grasping these spiritual concepts, but the Bible scholars, the people who knew this, the Bible study experts, the Bible experts, didn't get it. They didn't get it. They didn't understand it. They didn't grasp it. They didn't even want to receive it. So let's start off here again in verse 8 and see what Jesus says. The wind, the place where it pleases, blows, and you hear the sound, but you don't know where it comes and unto where it goes. Thus so is everyone who is born from the Spirit. He talks about wind. He talks about going in different direction. You don't know where it's coming from, where it's going to. He's talking about blowing wind. What does this all mean? How does it all tie in? What is Jesus talking about here when he says phrases like the wind, the place where it pleases, blows, and you hear the sound, you don't know where it's coming and unto where it goes? What does it mean for those who are born of the Spirit? I think for us to really understand and grasp the concept of what Jesus is saying here, we need to first understand and pull from another verse, another chapter. In fact, the book of Ephesians, Paul's letter to the Ephesians. We're going to have to look and understand what grace is. So, well, what does that all mean? Grace and mercy, isn't it all the same thing? Well, no, it's not. We need to understand what grace really truly is. And once we get a basic understanding of what grace is, it'll tie beautifully into what Jesus is talking about here. Now you'll notice I said grace and not mercy. There's a difference. We're not going to go deep into grace and mercy. That's not what the purpose is here. But again, just a basic understanding. Grace is not mercy. Many people make the big mistake of comparing the two, using the two interchangeably. They use mercy. I'm saved by God's grace, meaning what they're saying is I'm saved by God's mercy. And they kind of use it interchangeably like, well, grace, mercy, they're the same. They're not the same. Grace is not mercy. Mercy is not grace. We have grace by God's mercy. Well, then, what is God's grace? Let's look at a verse here in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 10. Again, we're trying to build a foundation here in all this. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 10. For it is by His grace we are redeemed through faith, and this not being from us, but it is the gift of God, not from works, so that no one could boast. For we are His own creation, who were created in Yeshua, the Anointed One, for good works, those which God formerly ordained that we should walk in. Now, I have underlined some areas here that I want us to focus in. So look at this verse again and see where those words are and what they tie into. First of all, we read again this section here, for it is by His grace we are redeemed through faith. And this not from us, okay? In other words, it's not through our own being, it's not through our own effort, it's not through a moral living. Okay, we're called to live spiritually, not morally. That's important. There's a major difference, and I cannot wait till we get to do a study on not living morally, but living spiritually. And then you'll see how that ties together. So he says here, not from works, meaning our own efforts of trying to live morally or trying to do religious acts. Those are not the things which give us the grace. For it is by grace we have been redeemed through faith, and not being from us, but it is a gift of God. What? This grace is a gift of God, not from our works, so that no one can go around saying, look what we have done, meaning look how moral I am, look how good of a boy or a girl I am, look how good of a man or a woman I am. I do all these moral things, and I do all this moral living and live this moral lifestyle. I'm a good person. I go to church, I live a moral life. There you go, that's what God wants me. That's not what he's asking us to do here. Look where he says here in the next section. For we are his own creation, who were created in Yeshua, the Anointed One, for good works, those which God formerly ordained that we should walk in. So, I hear people talking about that our works don't count and they mean nothing. Okay, our works don't count, but some works do, because he just got finished saying in this verse here, he says, for good works. We've been created for good works. Why? Formerly ordained that we should walk in. We should walk in these good works. So, which is it? Well, it's the fact that we're supposed to live the spiritual life. And the spiritual life is one of good works that have been ordained or set from the very beginning that we should walk in. Again, born of the Spirit. People who are born of the Spirit live the spiritual life and produce the fruit of spiritual living. What is this fruit? Well, it's the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, and so forth. But it's not about living the moral life. It's about living the spiritual life. So what is grace then? I want you to think about this when a person says to you before, you probably heard this phrase before, have you ever noticed how graceful she is? Or that person sure is graceful, or that person has no grace. And usually what do you think of about a person who has no grace? They're people who when they move, they knock things over, they're bumbling about, like a bull in a china shop. Wherever they go to, it's like a dump truck, and they're pushing their way in, or a bulldozer, and they knock everything over. There's no grace to that person. And then we talk about a person with grace, they move, they flow. Again, we look at a person and say, boy, that's a very graceful person. That's because that person moves. See, grace is movement. But I'm going to put another definition here I want you to look at. This is a definition that was given by a friend of mine, which I think was fantastic. Here it is. I like this definition because it is spiritual power to accomplish the work that God has assigned to us to perform. That's a powerful statement. It's spiritual power that God has given to us to accomplish the work that he's given us. God has given us the responsibility of living a spiritual life. He's given us the responsibility of walking in the Spirit. But I thought it was about moral living. I thought it was about being good and going to church and learning a lot of New Testament and learning a lot of Bible and quoting Jesus and saying all these Christianese words and living just a good moral life as best as I can, and God's grace will cover the rest. No, that's not it. The spiritual person completely surrenders themselves to God's power. See, when we become followers of Jesus, this is what happens. When we're born of the Spirit, God gives us His power. We can't do it on our own. We have no ability to do it. That's what spiritual living is. It's living by the spiritual forces, living by the Spirit. So I'm following the spiritual path. I'm living the spiritual life. I'm living the way I'm supposed to, but I cannot do it unless I'm given power to do that. God has the mercy and says, here's my power. Here's my power that I'm giving you to live the life I want you to live. See, that's what's so fantastic about the good news, the gospel of Jesus. Jesus is saying, you can't live this moral life, but I'm going to give you the power to live the spiritual life. And when you live the spiritual life, the moral life comes from that. The morality, the fruit will already be there. You won't have to worry about trying not to do anything. You're living spiritually. So when we're living under grace or power, when we're living under God's power to do these things, we're now living and going into a flow, into a direction, into a flow of wind, flow of the river. We go into it. A friend of mine has a website, I think it's Biblical Foundations for Freedom. I'm not exactly sure. I might try to find a link if I can find it later on to leave it for you. But he talks about it's a flow, and I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. It's a flow. We are flowing by His Spirit. We're like the flow of the wind. So let's look at some of those concepts of what Jesus is talking about here, tied in with grace. We hear grace all the time. We're always talking about God's grace, but we throw it around so flippantly as if it's mercy and we can go live as best as we can, or, I just go to church, God saves by grace. We don't have a slightest understanding of what grace is because we've confused it with mercy. It's not mercy. It's a totally different concept. It's power from God to do the things He has assigned for us to do. That is to live the spiritual life. And it can only be accomplished by the Spirit of God. That's the grace. It's the grace, the Spirit that gives us this power to do it. This is wonderful things. This is wonderful material when we tie it all in together. Remember, we talked about in Genesis chapter 1, the Spirit of God was on the surface of the deep. And guess what happened? Things started popping up and the earth started taking shape. That's grace, my friends. That's exactly what God's grace is. God's grace is His power coming in to our formless, void lives, and things start changing. Light comes into our lives. It separates from the darkness. We start growing. That's grace. It's God's power. It's God's reproductive power in the spiritual realm. That's what grace is. So how does it tie in? Beautifully to John chapter 3, verse 8. Again, let's look at this verse here in John chapter 3, verse 8. Tied into it, what's he say? The wind, the place where it pleases, blows, and you hear the sound, but you do not know where it comes and into where it goes. Thus so is everyone who is born of the Spirit. What he's saying here is a person who's born of the Spirit, they're living in God's grace. They're living in His flow. They're living in His power, not His mercy. Don't misunderstand me. Mercy is part of the Christian life, of course. But it's God's grace. Too many Christians are trying to live by God's mercy in the sense that, I make a mistake, well, God's mercy will cover it. I made another mistake, God's mercy will cover it. That is not what we're called to do. We're called instead to live by His Spirit, which is the power of grace. It's the power of the Spirit to live in the spiritual life, the spiritual realm, and to grasp the concepts of the spiritual life. Those things, those concepts are only fueled by God's power or His grace. So again, what does he talk about in these verses? He makes a lot of different things, so how are spiritual people like wind? Well, there's a couple of ideas and reasons why they're wind. For instance, it says, it goes where they please. We, if we're living under the power of God's grace or His power, we go where we please. Go where we please. Why? Because our mind is controlled by the Spirit, and if our mind is controlled by the Spirit, our power comes from the Spirit, so we're going where it goes. We're going in the direction that it's going to take, and we want to go in those directions because our mind is desiring of what to do what the Spirit wants to. Remember what Paul talks about in Romans chapter 8, the mind that's controlled by the Spirit has the desire of the things of what the Spirit wants. We're following what those things. So we're like that. We're like the wind. We're being taken by the flow to areas where we don't know where it's going to take us or where it's coming from. We know who it comes from or what direction is going or where it's coming from. Where's it coming at us from? Have you ever seen water? Water, for instance, when wind blows on the water, what do you see? You see ripples. It's what it is. It's like wind on the water. In Jesus' day, sailing or boats powered by sail, I should say, were the livelihood. They depended on the wind for their livelihood. No wind, nothing sailed. Spices weren't shipped anywhere, or if it did on land, it took for a very long time, if at all, because it would be too dangerous to go over land in many places. So the wind was a very powerful force that people heavily relied on. It's the same way when it comes to the power of God. We're living in the wind of God. We're living in God's wind, the flow, where He's taking us. Where we're going to go, we don't know where we're going to go next. Life depended on the wind back then, just as our life depends on the wind of God taking us into the places where He wants us to go. I used to have a sailboat and I used to go sailing, and it was amazing. The wind would come from one direction. I would have to what they call tack. You would go against the wind. If the wind's coming from this direction here, you go against the wind this way. You can't go straight into, you should go this way, and then you shift and you go that way, and then you go this way. So you're tacking and you're going into different areas, and you're going where the wind is taking you, but you're using the wind to your advantage and to the way that you should be going to take you in the direction that you want to go. It's the same thing. The Spirit is leading us. The people who are born of the Spirit are just like that. But there's another concept that's brought in, and that is the world of mystery. The mysterious realm that Jesus is promising us. Many things in this mysterious realm we don't quite understand. What we have to do is expect life and see life full of wonder, full of understanding, full of uncertainty, I should say, but understanding that they're coming from God. These are ideas and concepts that God has given to us. He's pushing us in this direction. He's taking us in the direction where it's coming from, where it's taking us, we know who it's coming from, but we don't know what direction it's going to come from and what direction it's going to take. That requires faith. It's amazing when you start putting these things together. But the spiritual realm, like I said, is a mysterious realm. Not mysterious in the sense that it's unknown and can never be known. No, it means that we go digging deeper into the spiritual things of life, the mysteries of life. But yet so often we're too scared. We're being invited to a kind of a portal into another world. And it's not really just a portal where we peek in and we come out of it. No, it's a portal to where we're being asked to participate in it from the beginning. What God wanted us to do from the very beginning. He's making us into the full perfection of who He is. To do those things He has asked us to do and to walk in the way He wants us to walk. But we can't live in fear. I know too many Christians who live in fear of I better not search this thing in the spiritual realm because that's kind of weird and we don't going to get into this weird thing. Well, let me tell you something right now. Everything about being a follower of Jesus is going to be weird, okay? I promise you it's going to be strange. It's going to be strange to the world, of course, but it's also going to be strange to many of your church folk, your church members, the people who your brothers and sisters are going to look at you and saying, you're really far out there. Now, we're not talking about following other spiritual religions or spiritual practices. What I'm talking about is being open to where God takes us and what God is trying to reveal to us and not being afraid to make mistakes. If we make a mistake, it's okay. I may have said this before on one of my videos, but I remember one time I was listening to God and I was praying to Him and I was telling Him, there's so much I want to explore more, but I'm so afraid of making a mistake because I know if I make a mistake, I'm in trouble. And God made it very clear to me. He says, you're more afraid of making a mistake than I am of you making a mistake. In other words, God was telling me, don't be afraid of making a mistake. You're my son. Or you might be His daughter. Don't be afraid of making those mistakes because God will correct you if you have done to the next point, which is surrendered yourself fully to the teaching of the Spirit. The only way we can be graceful, the only way we can receive grace is to completely surrender to God. Remember what it says. God gives grace, or God doesn't give grace, or God gives grace to the humble. He doesn't give it to the proud. I'm paraphrasing here, okay? God gives grace to the humble. What does that mean? He gives power to the humble. Why? Because the proud don't need it. They think they have it. They think they can live the moralistic life. They think they can do these things. No. God gives grace to the humble. If we want to live under a full spiritual life. We have got to live in a spiritual worldview that is powered by grace. Powered by grace, meaning our power comes from the Spirit to live the life we have been called to do. So are we going to surrender ourselves? We have to ask, are we going to surrender ourselves? Are we going to miss out on so many opportunities? Are we going to be so fearful that we miss out on the opportunities in the spiritual realm God wants us to do? No, we don't want to be fearful. Fearful is the last place we want to be, because we don't live by a spirit of fear, do we? We heard that before, right, in Timothy? We live by a spirit of power. Spirit of grace is what it is. Spirit of power to live the life and accomplish the things that He's asked for us to do. So, tie it all in here. All of this is to do what? Fulfill our calling to live in the power of God, making Jesus Christ our Master, not only our Savior and Lord, our Master, the one who we look to for all spiritual guidance and truth. So, are we going to be spiritual people who are going to be like that of the wind, going in the direction, not knowing where it's coming from or where it's taking us? Are we going to be those individuals who are going to be open to hearing God and living by His power? Please make sure to share, hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe. We'll talk to you next time. Thanks.